Hi, we're back. This is the fourth class in Latin American Studies 3300. And today we will be having two guest speakers, but I have a few points from last week that I would like to finish up. But let me talk briefly about what we'll be doing today, and then I will get back to the points I was making about the colonial labor system last week. The first speaker that we will have today is Professor Phil Howard from the History Department, and he is going to be speaking about the Afro-Caribbean and Afro-Latin America more broadly, its early history, and he will particularly be talking about the history of slaves, the African enslaved, and the importance of the institution of slavery to the development of Latin America as we know it today. In the second half of class today, we will consider the music of the Afro-Caribbean and its relationship and contributions to populations beyond the Afro-Caribbean, especially for the African-American population of the U.S. But last week we were talking about the development of the colonial economy, because one of the things that I've been doing in my lectures so far is to trace the history of development, the development of colonial institutions. And I've argued that this is important not only in its own right, because we need to understand something about how those worked in order to understand the nature of history, politics, culture, economics, and society in the colonial period, but we also need to understand these institutions because they help us understand modern and contemporary Latin America as well. If you remember from the PowerPoint outline last week, we were talking in the last part of class about native labor. And I had been talking in particular about encomienda. And hopefully you remember that encomienda is the practice of a grant of tribute and labor to a conqueror or colonist, which provides the conqueror or colonist with access to labor and to goods, but it's not a grant of land. And how land was transferred, that's a separate matter that we are not focusing on right now. We also talked about some of the problems in encomienda, and the problems, in particular, the pattern of mortality with native people dying out in very large numbers, led to the evolution of the labor system, and the practice of repartimiento replaced the practice of encomienda. And repartimiento, if you remember, the term refers to a rotational labor draft, and it has significance because it introduced first the idea of paying a wage for the labor. Now, of course, the wage, as I noted, was intended in large part to help with the payments of taxes. So tribute was evolving into taxation, and labor and taxation were being separated from each other in a way that they had not been through the practice of encomienda. Repartimiento also represented an effort on the part of the Spanish crown to moderate and control better the amounts of labor that were being used by Spanish colonists. Was that effort wholly successful? No, it was not. There were still many abuses on the part of both private enterprise as well as abuses by officials of the Spanish state who had access to repartimiento labor. And there was still the problem of mortality. And mortality was a greater and greater problem as time wore on. Because as time wore on, Spanish enterprises, particularly in terms of the large landed estates or haciendas that were beginning to develop, and in terms of the silver mining, the development of silver mining, which I talked about last week in the last class as an important development, within the external or overseas economy, as these kinds of economic activities became more and more important, repartimiento, because of the abuses associated with it, but in particular because of the pattern of mortality, which continued to be problematic well into the 17th century in Mexico and Peru, meant that these enterprises, haciendas and silver mines, had a lot of difficulty simply having enough access to the labor they needed. And what owners of mines and owners of haciendas began to do on their own was pay higher wages. And what then begins to happen is an evolution away from and a movement away from reliance on the institution of repartimiento towards a reliance and use of wage labor. Is this free wage labor in the modern or contemporary sense of the term? No, it is not, because it also has elements, strong elements of coercion in it. How does it have elements of coercion? It has elements of coercion because even though owners and managers are willing to pay higher wages to attract a labor force, the labor they expect is very difficult. And labor, because of mortality patterns, could also be in short supply. And silver mines in particular were under a great deal of pressure to be as productive as possible. And so what happens is that accompanying wage labor is the evolution of debt peonage. And debt peonage is the practice of owners and managers advancing wages, providing housing, providing food, providing perhaps clothing. And then what the worker is doing, instead of truly working for wages, the worker is working to pay off the debt. It is not wholly dissimilar from those of us who have credit cards with lots of money on the credit, charged to the credit card, and we pay the minimum payment. And then we're always in a situation where we're in debt to the bank. And the debt is actually growing larger. It's very similar in the system of wage labor and debt peonage as it was practiced in many times and places in colonial Latin America. When labor was more abundant, then the practice of debt peonage was not as coercive. But when labor was scarce, it could be very coercive. So many forms of labor during the colonial period had elements of coercion that were central to them. And this, I think, relates to the nature of the economy, the time period certainly, the nature of the economy where you have a complex structure in which there is both an internal and an external economy. There's tremendous need for labor. Labor at times is in very short supply. And laborers are pressured because encomienda, repartimiento, or wage labor may at times work better and at other times work more poorly. In terms of the institutional history of the colonial period, I also want to talk about the political structure briefly, but I will either do that later today or in the next class. What I want to go on and do now is to introduce Professor Howard and to connect for you what he's going to talk about with what I've been talking about by reminding you that when we talked especially about encomienda, we talked about how abusive it was in many times and places, and how while legally encomienda was different from slavery and distinguished clearly by the Spanish crown as a different institution. On the ground, if we were to look at it in practice, it would seem somewhat similar. Nonetheless, enslavement and slavery has a separate history, and a history that's also very important to know about, because the history of slavery dominates the emergence of the colonial economy in certain parts of Latin America, and the history of slavery also helps to explain the complex patterns of diversity among Latin American populations. And so I will turn this over to Professor Howard, and he'll pick it up from there.
What I want to do today is talk about the origins and the expansion of African slavery, basically in the Americas, and look at its impact on the Iberian American economy, as well as the non-Iberian economies of the Caribbean. Why did Iberians and non-Iberian Europeans, particularly the British, Dutch, and French, establish African slavery in the Americas? Well, to answer that question, one has to examine a host of political, social, and economic, and even cultural factors or variables that existed in Europe, in Africa, as well as the Americas. It's important to note that both in Europe and in Africa, their societies had employed slave labor or some type of forced labor system in the past. During the Middle Ages, for instance, feudalism replaced slavery, and by the age of discovery, many peoples, not only in the Iberian Peninsula, but also in England, France, and Holland, worked and lived under some type of forced labor system where they were serfs, paying tribute and rent to their lords in exchange for some property, the right to work that property, as well as their legal protection. In Africa, natural disasters, famine, droughts, floods, compelled people there to voluntarily become slaves to either a group of people, different kinship organizations, corporate villages, or even a host of polities in order to take care of them in exchange for their labor. And the point is that according to David Eltis and John Thornton, two historians that have examined forced labor systems in Europe and in Africa, that somewhere between 70 and 80% of all peoples in Europe and in Africa lived under and worked under some type of forced labor system. It's no wonder then that when there was a demand for labor after the dramatic decline of the indigenous populations by 1600, Iberians and later British, French, and Dutch people would adopt slavery in the Americas. The difference between African slavery that emerged in the Americas and the one that existed in Africa was quite different. In the African context, slaves never gave up a host of rights that they enjoyed as Africans. That included the right to enjoy property, the right to retain and exhibit their identity, cultural identity, the right to have children and parent their children, the right to marriage, and overall they never gave up the right to their humanity. Many African societies also created a host of social, cultural, and political mechanisms that guaranteed the subsequent integration of African slaves in the African context. Okay. More importantly, those enslaved in Africa by other Africans were never slaves for life. On the other hand, the type of African slavery that emerged in the Americas quickly became chattel slavery. And what I mean by that is simply that the African was transformed into a piece of property by Europeans. Another, yes?
I was wondering, in Africa, were slave children born slaves, or were they born free?
They were born slaves, but again, the societies that they were born into created rituals, legal systems that they could employ in order to facilitate their freedom and subsequent integration into society. Whether that was by age, female children were granted their freedom sooner than males, particularly if their owners found a husband for them, for instance. Other societies had courts that ensured that traditional law was applied that freed slaves in those societies as well. Okay. Another variable that explains why African slavery emerged in the Americas was the pre-existing commercial relationship Europeans, particularly the Portuguese, the Spanish, and later the Dutch, had with African societies along the West Central African and South Central African coasts before 1500. These commercial ties were established as early as the 13th century and expanded in the 14th and 15th centuries. Europeans went to Africa in order to acquire, more than anything else, gold. But the Africans who controlled this trade not only exchanged gold and salt and food in exchange for European goods, they also added human beings that were captured in war or were outsiders or considered outsiders to their societies. As a result, one sees a small but noticeable number of African slaves being imported into the Iberian Peninsula during the latter part of the 1300s as well as the 1400s. There in Europe, particularly Portugal and in Spain, they became skilled laborers, particularly in the urban areas of Europe, working as masons, carpenters, cartographers, shipbuilders, porters, dock workers, and in other occupations. While in Europe, they converted to Catholicism and they learned to speak Portuguese and Spanish. These assimilated African slaves were called Ladinos. Okay. And it's important to note that the first Africans to arrive in the Americas accompanied Columbus into the Caribbean. They accompanied Cortez and the Pizarro brothers as they conquered the mainland of Mexico, Central America, and the Andean region. By the second quarter of the 15th century, something very important caused the Europeans to redirect the trade in African slaves away from Europe and into the Atlantic world. And that was the move of the sugar complex from Palestine, Greece, Sicily, and into the Atlantic islands located off the coast of West Africa. The Canary Islands were opened up to sugar production. Sao Tome was opened up to sugar production. And the Madeiras were opened up to sugar production. And both the Spanish and the Portuguese purchased African slaves in order to work their sugar estates on these islands. This slave labor working off the coast of Africa proved to be efficient, cheap, and profitable. And this explains why, in my opinion, the Portuguese and the Spanish later extended the system into the Americas. Meanwhile, in the American context, there were a number of variables that caused African slavery to emerge gradually. As Professor Kellogg just mentioned, the European encounter entailed the conquest of urban-based, skilled indigenous populations in Mexico and the Andean region. The Spanish simply imposed the authority on the indigenous by employing a forced tributary labor system that, according to some cultural anthropologists, the indigenous were already familiar with. And that explains the adoption and the efficacy of both the encomienda and the repartimiento during the first century of the Iberian world in America. But what encouraged the adoption of African slavery was the dramatic loss of life, indigenous life, as a result of old world disease, as well as the oppressive and repressive nature of both the encomienda and the repartimiento, both becoming forced labor systems. Meanwhile, in Brazil, the initial Portuguese encounter along the coast with the Tupinamba, the Tupi and Guarani peoples resulted also in the introduction of forms of forced labor that dramatically led to the destruction of indigenous life. But more importantly, after the Portuguese crown sent its first captaincy generals to Brazil, along with Portuguese immigrants, in order to settle Brazil in the 1530s, and more importantly, to make these settlers produce some type of cash crop. Around the 1550s did African slavery take off in a substantial way. Of course, that cash crop proved to be sugar. Existing political and economic variables in both the old world and the new world that subsequently contributed to the introduction of African slavery. There were also ideological reasons why Europeans abandoned indigenous labor for African slaves. The debate between Juan Gines Sepulveda and Bartolomé de las Casas in the early 1550s basically sealed the fate of the Africans in the Americas. Sepulveda was a priest and a important advisor to the Spanish crown. He believed in Aristotle's notion that there were some people who were simply naturally born inferior to Europeans, and this included the indigenous of the Americas. Sepulveda characterized Indians as, quote, so uncivilized, so barbaric, with so many sins and obscenities, adding that they were as inferior to the Spaniard as children are to adults and women are to men, end quote. De las Casas proved to be a convincing pro-Indian advocate that convinced the Crown to protect Native American life, while ignoring the humanity of Africans. It proves that Las Casas was simply by the 1550s confirming what royal policy had been transformed into, and that was to protect Native American life with the decrees of the new laws of 1542 and 1543. While there was a debate with regards to the nature of Native Americans, colonial officials in Mexico and in Peru were evaluating the nature of African humanity. Surviving archival manuscripts convey general impressions of the way the African was perceived by the Spaniard. He was considered, quote, naturally evil, of bad race, and of bad caste, end quote. A Spanish traveler in Mexico, Gomez de Cervantes, observed that Africans, particularly Afro-Mexicans, had become, quote, people of little shame and trust, end quote. An official who worked for the Inquisition noted that a witness, quote, being a slave was a vile person, end quote. One viceroy was convinced that blacks constituted, quote, vicious people, end quote. Another observed that, quote, mulattoes, the offspring of Europeans and Africans, were naturally arrogant, audacious, and fond of change, end quote. And by the end of the 16th century, the Cabildo of Lima, the city council, remarked in 1598 that black slaves were, quote, bellicose, bestial, and ferocious, end quote. In short, archival manuscripts demonstrate that although the nature of Africans wasn't being debated among scholars in Europe, the nature of Africans was indeed being evaluated in the American context, and these colonial officials were dehumanizing the African in order to justify their subsequent enslavement. Yes.
So, are you saying that while the Africans were being evaluated and debated, were they in a lower category than the indigenous people, although the indigenous people were considered uncivilized and barbaric? How did that value system work for them?
That's a good question. The Spanish colonial social system can be viewed as a pyramid, social pyramids, with the Europeans on top because of their culture and intelligence and their blood. And although the slaves were being dehumanized, they were placed in the middle, not so much for their intelligence and culture, but because of their economic attributes as skilled and unskilled labor. In fact, they were viewed as people without reason and culture. And the Spanish crown placed at the bottom of the social structure the indigenous population. But I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that while Europeans in Spain and Portugal were debating the nature and the humanity of the indigenous as well as the African, royal policy was developed to favor and to protect Indian life and culture, while policy that was articulated in the introduction of African slavery tended to destroy African humanity and try to destroy, let me put it that way, African humanity and culture. I'm sure later on in the course, Professor Kellogg will talk about colonial society, in which there were three parts, basically. And for all intents and purposes, that social structure promoted a degree of racial or ethnic and cultural separation between European, the indigenous, and the African. Any other questions or comments? It's a really good question.
I would just comment, in addition to what Professor Howard has just said, that what's complex about, well, there are many things that are complex about race, ethnicity, and society in colonial Latin America, some of which has to do with region. That is, there are variations regionally. But I think what Professor Howard is getting at is that there is a sort of contradiction that lies at the heart of the colonial, an aspect of colonial society that is important to take note of, and that is that the social structure in which the indigenous groups really are at the bottom is different from the legal structure in which you could say Africans are at the bottom, because the indigenous people cannot be enslaved. Spanish law says they can't be enslaved, whereas Africans can be enslaved. But many Africans who came very early, like those who came with Columbus or Cortez, some of those people were enslaved, but some of them were not. They were free. And they came because they had skills that the Spanish wanted to use. So there are many contradictions in terms of the nature of society and who has what place. It's not simple to say exactly what the social structure is, and we need to understand something about how society works and how law works, and they're not exactly the same thing.
Because of royal policy and because of the overall evaluation of what was perceived as African, and which led to Africans being dehumanized, Africans began to arrive in Peru, Mexico, the Spanish Caribbean, in Brazil, then all of the European immigrants to come to the Americas. It's important to note that Spain was underpopulated for all intents and purposes, and simply did not have the people to travel to the Americas and an exploit the two principal resources of the Americas, land and the labor that inhabited that land. Portugal, at the end of the 15th century, only held 1 million people. And it's interesting to note that the Portuguese were not only sailing down the coast of Africa, but they were also in India and in Asia. And they simply did not have the people to settle and possess Brazil. European immigration was stifled after American goods, gold and silver, and tropical staples began to arrive in the Iberian Peninsula. And these goods prompted rapid urbanization and increased wages. There was no reason for Iberians to leave either Spain nor Portugal in large numbers. In England, France, and Holland, those countries had what the Iberians didn't, and that was cheap, unemployed labor. And so when these Northwestern Europeans arrive in the Americas after 1600, they attempt to solve the labor shortages with their own people who were indentured servants. Indentured servants were individuals who signed contracts to labor for an individual. The contract period extended from 3 to 7 years, at the end of which the indentured was released from the contract and was allowed to purchase some small piece of property. But by 1600, even this form of labor had become too costly. So the British, the French, and the Dutch turned to Africa for its labor as well. The emergence of African slavery in Spanish America and Portuguese America and later the Caribbean cannot be explained by the previous variables. And basically one of the most important variable that explains the emergence of African slavery in America was the simple fact that there was a large supply of African slaves, and that the price for these slaves remained relatively stable between 1550 and 1800. In other words, the cost to produce an African slave. What I mean by cost, I mean the cost it took African merchants and polities to raid in order to acquire outsiders for the slave trade, the cost African polities used to make war in order to acquire slaves, as well as the transportation of those captured by raiding or conquest and transported from the interior to the coast, remained lower than the cost of European goods that were exchanged for African slaves. Most slaves came from 4 principal regions along the coast. They came from the Senegambia region that stretches from what is today Senegal down to Liberia. The second region was the Gold Enslaved Coast that includes today Ghana, Nigeria, and the Cameroons. The third region was the Congo River Delta and Angola. And the fourth region that the Portuguese acquired most of their slaves during the 18th and 19th century was Mozambique. It's important to note that the slave trade lasted between 1450 and 1868. And the trade produced probably 20 million African slaves during this period. But it's also noteworthy to mention that only 10 million to 12 million survived the Middle Passage and worked as chattel slaves in the Americas. Of this last figure, 10 to 12 million, the Portuguese purchased the most or consumed the most. Some scholars say that they consumed 46% of that 12 million, while the Spanish purchased 18%, and the other European countries 30%. The slave trade and African slavery became a viable institution after 1550. And the first Spanish-American region that purchased and employed slave labor was Peru, particularly the citizens of Lima. Many scholars have described African slavery in Peru as being urban in nature. Although some slaves worked in the mines surrounding Potosi, most lived in places like Lima, Cusco, and Cajamarca. They performed a host of tasks. They were domestic servants. They were used by the Spanish colonial government for public works such as the construction of roads, bridges, and the Catholic Church used slave labor to build their elaborate cathedrals, nunneries, and other religious buildings and institutions. Many also worked in the countryside as farmers and ranchers. In the urban areas, they became masons, carpenters, porters, dock workers, and even were employed as sailors in the Spanish Navy. Many others simply became prized possessions of the ruling class. According to James Lockhart, a historian that studies the Andean region, quote, black slaves were one essential part of the general pattern of Spanish ambition. No encomendero or landowner felt happy until he owned a large house, land, livestock, and most to the point, Negro slaves. Because African slaves performed both skilled and unskilled labor in Peru, particularly in the urban areas, and which afforded many slaves to rent themselves out to non-slaveholding individuals. Some earned enough money to purchase their freedom. And once free, they entered into Peruvian society's economy. Although they were free, this does not mean that they never confronted or experienced racism and discrimination, for they did. By 1600, African slaves accounted for approximately 15% of the total black population in Peru. And in 1646, they numbered over 100,000. Mexico became the second major zone for slave importation. Before the 1540s, their numbers tended to equal the number of Spanish immigrants. But once sugar and food production increased in the lowland areas, their numbers began to grow. And by the end of the 16th century, sugar planters in Mexico owned between 40 and 50 slaves who were responsible for cutting and refining sugar cane. But there was a difference between Peruvian and Mexican African slavery. Unlike Peru, slaves in Mexico worked in the mines of Zacatecas and Pachuco. In fact, there were probably more than 4,000 African slaves at these mines as early as the 1570s. And by the turn of the 17th century, they accounted for approximately 45 to 50% of all mine workers in Mexico. African slaves were also found in the textile mills and factories, too. But the importance of slavery in Mexico was short-term and less significant than other parts of the early colonial Spanish-American period. For instance, in the 1570s, there were only 20,000 African slaves in Mexico, and that figure only grew by 15,000 by the middle part of the 17th century, totaling 35,000 in 1646. The reason why African slavery was less significant than in other parts was simply because of the size of the indigenous population that the Spanish used to exploit Mexico's resources. African slavery in Brazil appeared as early as 1532, when sugar masters from the Madeira Islands and Sao Tome began to arrive with their knowledge of sugarcane and technology. And what they did was establish their plantations in the northeastern regions of Pernambuco and Bahia. To make a long story short, as the number of sugar estates increased, so too did the number of African slaves. In the 1580s, Brazil contained 2,000 slaves that worked on 66 sugar mills, or estates, But by 1600, that number had grew dramatically. In 1600, there were over 50,000 African slaves in Brazil. These slaves would produce between 8,000 to 9,000 tons of sugar per year and over 14,000 tons of sugar by the 1620s. And as sugar technology lowered the cost of producing sugar, slave imports continued to grow. The point is that between 1640 and 1650, more African slaves arrived in Brazil than to Spanish America. It is also at this time that Brazil would become the world's largest producer of sugar. The Brazilian model became reputable in Europe and would become the model that the Dutch, British, and French would employ in the Caribbean. The people of Holland, the Dutch, became responsible for the expansion of sugar and slavery into the Caribbean during the early part of the 17th century. Their role in this endeavor started during the Spanish consolidation of the Spanish and Portuguese crowns that took place between 1580 and the 1630s. After Holland had waged war against Spain and succeeded in throwing Spanish colonialism off in 1609, the Dutch proceeded to wage war against Spain and the Portuguese. The Dutch did this by evading Brazil after Spain refused to allow Dutch shipping to Brazil. The Dutch created a corporation called the Dutch West Indies Company, and this company used its navy to capture the town of Salvador in the province of Bahia. In 1627, the Dutch also seized Recife, which was at the time the prime sugar port located in Pernambuco. The Dutch didn't stop there. It stifled the Spanish and Portuguese slave trade to Brazil and Spanish America by capturing Portuguese African possessions at Elmina on the Gold Coast in 1638, in Luanda on the Angolan coast in 1641. And it's during the Dutch occupation of Brazil that the sugar complex was moved from Pernambuco to Bahia. The long-term impact on the Americas was that the Dutch, particularly in Brazil, became the source for the tools, the techniques, the credit, and the African slaves that they would introduce to the British and the French in the Caribbean and thereby revolutionizing the sugar complex initially in the Lesser Antilles. As a result, after 1645, the Dutch began to deliver slaves and sugar technology to other Europeans that settled the Caribbean. They did so first in a small island called Barbados, which the British possessed, and later introduced sugar and slaves to the French, who settled the islands of Martinique and Guadeloupe. It's interesting to note that the Dutch provided these European settlers not only with modern refining technology, but also the African slaves and the credit used to purchase technology in the African slaves to the local planters. The Dutch were also responsible for providing the ships that the French and the British employed to ship their sugar back to Europe. By the 1650s, events in the Lesser Antilles caused the French and the English to take over, capture, and seize lands that neither the Portuguese or the Spanish never fully settled. And what you see in this process is a dramatic alteration in the demography of the Caribbean. Barbados, Martinique, Guadeloupe initially were European settler communities or islands. In other words, there were always more Europeans than African slaves. But by 1700, because of sugar, more than any other commodity, the slave populations outgrew the European settler populations, turning these Lesser Antillean islands into African enclaves. The same thing would happen in the Greater Antilles of Jamaica by the 1730s and 40s, Saint-Domingue by the 1720s, and the largest island in the Caribbean, Cuba, by 1800. By 1700, Brazil had imported more slaves than any American colony, some 600,000. The non-Iberian Caribbean by 1700 had imported 450,000 African slaves. And it's important to note that there were also, by 1700, 400,000 slaves on the Spanish mainland. To give you a sense of the scope of what was going on in Iberian America and the Caribbean, in 1700 there were only 30,000 African slaves in British North America. what the arrival of the African did was change the demography of the Americas, as imports tended to outnumber the gradual and naturally producing European immigrant populations of Brazil and some parts of Spanish America. Their numbers indeed were more in the Caribbean. According to Franklin Knight and Margaret Crahan, by the middle of the 18th century, in certain parts of Spanish America, and definitely in Portuguese America, would be the African who would influence the cultural institutions of those societies. And such was also the case in the non-Iberian Caribbean. By 1700, European society in the Americas had become dependent upon African slave labor. And what I mean by that is simply they were found in every occupation and providing every type of service in the Americas. They sailed in the Spanish and Portuguese navies. They were fishermen. Okay. They were ranchers. They were farmers. In Mexico, they mined the silver and the gold. In the Caribbean, they cut the sugar. They cut sugar cane. And they produced other tropical staples that, according to many scholars, were shipped back to Europe, inspired further capital investment that led to the formation of much capital that helped Great Britain industrialize itself by the first half of the 19th century. Questions or comments? I wish I could talk to you about the cultural impact of the African. The music, the diet.
Earlier in your lecture, you were talking about that there were some Africans that were freed from time to time, I guess, and you said they sort of moved into the society they were brought up. Is there any stories, I find that interesting, it's kind of off topic, of Africans who were enslaved or that returned back to Africa? Was there a large number of them that did, or did they just settled where they were freed at?
Let's see here. Unlike the non-Iberian American context, both the Portuguese and the Spanish created mechanisms and traditions that allowed African slaves to purchase themselves out of slavery. The process was called coartation, self-purchase, or manumission. Manumission often occurred among urban slaves who had the opportunity to rent themselves out. More importantly, these urban slaves developed the skills needed to work in the urban areas. That also generated money or savings. Okay. One of the more interesting demographic characteristics that also led to the emergence of a freed colored class was the simple fact that, unlike North America, Spanish America and Luso America was settled by men who came to the Americas without their families. And according to one of my professors who taught me these events, European men had to gird their loins with someone, and they tend to gird their loins with African females. The result was a degree of miscegenation unknown here in North America, the United States. Sometimes slave owners recognize their children of African descent. Sometimes they did not. Many did. And they were educated and incorporated into society. They stayed because they provided urban Spanish America as well as Brazil with key labor that only they could perform. Both the Spanish and the Portuguese also allowed them to create cultural institutions that tended to convince them that they were American more than African. And when they had children, their children were indeed American-born people with an American identity. It's not until the British determined that African slave labor is no longer profitable and efficient. That doesn't take place until the first quarter of the 19th century, the 1800s. And it's during the first quarter of the 19th century that the British use its powerful navy to capture off the coast of Africa slave ships. And what they did was to give the Africans involved in the Middle Passage a couple of options. They could either continue on to America and face a precarious reality, the possibility including enslavement by unscrupulous slave owners who continue to demand labor, particularly in the island of Cuba and, of course, the United States South, or return to their societies in Africa. Maybe a decade ago, a Cuban scholar by the name of Gabino Saraceno did a really small book that you can only find in Cuba that examine what happened to slaves captured along the Cuban coast and who decided to return to Africa, basically. And their numbers were relatively small compared to the free population, the African population that had no choice but to stay.
As we come to an end, I'd like to ask Professor Howard if, given that slavery has been one of the areas of the greatest concentration of historians working on this history and producing so much rich literature, if there are one or two books that you could recommend for the students that you think are particularly good on this particular subject.
Sure. There's
Tons.
There's a large body of literature on this topic. On the emergence of slavery in Mexico in the 16th century, probably the most influential and classical work was a small book written by Colin Palmer, Palmer. The title of which escapes me.
I think it's Black Slaves of the White God.
That is correct. Thank you very much.
It's Black Slaves of the White God.
Okay. Right. Peruvian African slavery was explored and examined by a historian by the name of Frederick Bowser. And the name is straightforward, African slavery in Peru. And Stuart Schwartz did a classical study on the emergence of plantation African slavery in Brazil during the 16th and 17th centuries.